When I first started learning English, I was terrible. People laughed at my pronunciation. I couldn't even form a simple sentence without getting stuck. Sometimes I wanted to give up, but one thing I knew, if I stopped trying, nothing would ever change. When I started learning English, I had no idea how difficult the road would be. At that time, I could not even introduce myself properly without feeling embarrassed. Every word felt heavy on my tongue, and every sentence seemed to collapse halfway. People around me laughed at my strange pronunciation, and some even told me it was useless for me to try. But deep inside, I had this feeling that if I could learn this language, doors would open, opportunities would come, and my world would be bigger than the one I was living in. I didn't have money for classes, I didn't have famous teachers, and I didn't have any special advantage. What I had was the desire to learn, and that desire became my fuel. In the beginning, I started very small. I read whatever I could find. Newspapers, magazines, shop signs, even product labels. I repeated words aloud, even if they sounded silly. I remember standing in front of a mirror, practicing a simple line again and again until I could say it with confidence. I forced myself to listen to radio programs in English, though I barely understood a word. At first, it felt like I was wasting time, but slowly, my ears began to catch patterns, tones, and words that became familiar. I realized that the more I surrounded myself with English, the more comfortable I became. Of course, it was never smooth. People laughed at my mistakes. They corrected me in public. They made fun of the way I said things. At first, this was painful, and I questioned if it was even worth continuing. But later, I discovered something important. When people laugh at you, it means you are trying. It means you are doing something different. And if you can endure the laughter, you will grow stronger. Every rejection, every failure, every mistake became part of my training. Instead of feeling shame, I used those moments as lessons. I told myself, if I don't make mistakes, I will never improve. I learned another powerful truth: real learning does not happen by memorizing books alone. It happens when you use the language in real life. So I pushed myself to speak, even when I felt shy. I practiced with friends. I practiced with strangers. I practiced with tourists who visited my city. Sometimes they didn't understand me. Sometimes they laughed, but I kept speaking. Every conversation was a battle, but also a step forward. The more I spoke, the less afraid I became, and slowly, confidence replaced fear. It was not quick. It took years of practice. Some days I felt like I was moving backward. Some days I felt no progress at all. But persistence is stronger than talent. I never thought of giving up because I believed in the long game. I believed that if I continued, no matter how slow, one day I would arrive. And that belief gave me the patience to keep working. One of the habits that helped me most was turning ordinary moments into learning opportunities. When I walked on the street, I translated signs in my head. When I watched a movie, I repeated the lines. When I read an article, I underlined new words and used them in my own sentences. Slowly, English stopped being a subject I studied. It became a part of my daily life. That is when learning transformed from a burden into a joy. I realized fluency was not about perfection. It was about communication. When I stopped worrying about grammar and focused on expressing my ideas, my fluency improved. People could understand me, and I could understand them. The small victories built my confidence, and the confidence gave me more courage to practice. It became a positive cycle that pushed me forward. There were moments when I looked back and was surprised. The boy who once struggled to say a single sentence was now able to hold conversations, give talks, and connect with people from different parts of the world. That transformation was not magic, it was persistence. It was the result of refusing to give up when it was easier to quit. My journey from beginner to fluent taught me more than just a language. It taught me about patience, resilience, and the power of small daily actions. It taught me that you don't need the best resources to achieve something. You only need determination and consistency. It taught me that failure is not the opposite of success. It is part of success. And most importantly, it showed me that no matter where you start, you can always go further if you believe in the process and keep moving forward. When I think back to the days when I first started learning English, I can still remember the feeling of standing in front of a word and not knowing how to pronounce it. I would look at books and articles and feel like I was facing a wall too high to climb. People around me didn't expect much from me, and honestly, sometimes I didn't expect much from myself either. But there was one thought that kept me going. If I didn't start, if I didn't try, I would stay in the same place forever. That idea scared me more than failure, and it gave me the courage to begin even though I had nothing but curiosity and determination. At the start, my resources were almost zero. I didn't have access to expensive schools or professional teachers. I didn't have technology to guide me or apps that could explain everything step by step. What I did have was a desire so strong that it made me creative. I began by listening to the sounds of the language wherever I could find them. I stood near tourists and tried to catch their words. I tuned into English programs on the radio even if I didn't understand them. I repeated phrases to myself again and again until they began to feel natural on my tongue. My friends thought I was strange, wasting hours on something that seemed impossible. But I knew every small effort was like planting seeds that would one day grow. Of course, there were times when I failed badly. I mispronounced words, I forgot sentences halfway, and sometimes I stood frozen with nothing to say. People laughed, some mocked me, and a few even advised me to stop embarrassing myself. Those moments were painful, but they also became powerful lessons. I discovered that being laughed at is not the end of the world. In fact, it is a sign that you are doing something different from the crowd. If you can accept the laughter, if you can face the rejection, then you are already stronger than most. Every mistake carved a lesson into me, every rejection added fuel to my fire, and every failure made my desire to succeed even sharper. As I kept going, I realized one very important truth: language is not about memorization, it is about communication. Reading books gave me knowledge, but using the language gave me fluency. So I pushed myself to speak, no matter how broken my sentences were. I spoke to friends, to foreigners, even to myself in the mirror. Sometimes people understood me, sometimes they didn't, but every attempt was practice, and practice was progress. Slowly, I began to see that fluency is built not in one big leap, but in thousands of small steps. The journey was long and often frustrating. There were days when I felt I had learned nothing, days when I thought I was stuck forever, and days when I questioned why I was putting myself through this struggle. But persistence kept me alive. I told myself that as long as I did not quit, improvement was guaranteed. I didn't measure success by weeks or months. I measured it by my ability to continue despite obstacles. The secret was not speed. The secret was consistency. One habit that transformed my learning was making English part of my daily life. I wrote simple notes in English. I sang songs in English even if my voice was terrible. I thought in English whenever I could, turning my thoughts into practice. Over time, the language stopped being something I studied from the outside. It became part of me. That shift was the turning point because learning no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a natural process. Another important discovery was that fluency is not perfection. In the beginning, I wasted so much energy worrying about grammar and perfect sentences. But as I practiced more, I saw that people care more about your ideas than your mistakes. Once I focused on sharing my message instead of avoiding errors, my confidence grew. The more confident I became, the more I practiced. And the more I practiced, the better I became. Confidence and practice worked together like two wings that allowed me to fly further each day. Looking back, I see that the path from beginner to fluent was not just about English. It was about building a mindset. It taught me patience when progress was slow. It taught me resilience when I faced criticism. It taught me creativity when I lacked resources. Most of all, it taught me that anyone, no matter how small their beginning, can achieve something big if they are willing to keep going without giving up. When I began my journey of learning English, I was filled with uncertainty and fear. The first time I tried to speak, my tongue felt heavy, my voice shook, and the people around me stared as if I had said something strange. I could see the smiles, sometimes the laughter, and I felt like running away. But deep inside, I knew that if I didn't continue, if I didn't push through that discomfort, I would never change. I didn't have teachers guiding me step by step. I didn't have expensive tools or special classes, but I had one thing that was more valuable than all of that, the determination to learn no matter how hard it became. At the beginning, I started with very small actions. I picked up words from newspapers, magazines, and even the packaging on products I bought from shops. I repeated them out loud, even if they didn't sound correct. I tuned in to English radio programs and television shows, and though I barely understood anything at first, I forced myself to keep listening. My brain felt lost in the ocean of sounds, but slowly, piece by piece, I began to recognize words, then phrases, and then meanings. I realized that learning a language is like planting seeds. You don't see the results right away, but if you water them daily, they begin to grow. The road was not smooth. I failed many times. I mispronounced words, forgot them as quickly as I learned them, and sometimes froze completely when trying to have a conversation. People laughed at me, and I can't deny it hurt. But I made an important decision. I would not let laughter stop me. I told myself that being laughed at is not shameful, but giving up because of it is. I discovered that failure is not my enemy. In fact, it is my teacher. Every mistake I made showed me where I needed to improve. Every rejection I faced gave me more strength to continue. One day I realized that learning doesn't come from memorizing grammar rules alone. It comes from using the language. I began to practice whenever I could. I spoke with friends who were patient enough to listen. I practiced with tourists who came to my city even when my words were broken. I practiced in front of the mirror, pretending I was giving a speech. Every time I spoke, I grew a little braver. The sentences were not perfect, but perfection was not the goal. Communication was the goal, and slowly, communication became possible. The progress was not quick. Some days, I felt like I was learning nothing at all. Some days I felt frustrated and wanted to quit. But persistence became my greatest weapon. I kept reminding myself that small steps taken daily are more powerful than a big step taken once. I measured my progress not by how fast I was learning, but by the fact that I was still learning. That thought gave me strength to keep going. To make English part of my life, I created habits that connected the language with everything I did. I thought in English whenever possible, turning my thoughts into silent practice. I wrote notes in English, even if they were simple sentences. I sang songs in English, not worrying about my voice, but focusing on the words. Slowly, English became more than something I studied. It became a part of my everyday life. That was the turning point, because when learning feels natural, it no longer feels like a burden. Another lesson I discovered was that fluency does not mean speaking without mistakes. For too long, I wasted time worrying about grammar, fearing that people would notice every small error. But I learned that people don't care about perfect grammar as much as they care about understanding what you mean. When I focused on sharing my thoughts instead of avoiding mistakes, my confidence grew. Confidence gave me courage, courage gave me practice, and practice gave me fluency. Looking back now, I can see that my journey from beginner to fluent was about much more than just learning English. It was about building discipline, patience, and resilience. It was about learning to keep moving forward, even when progress felt invisible. It was about facing rejection and not letting it define me. It was about realizing that starting small is not a weakness, but the very foundation of success. And it was about proving to myself that no matter how difficult something seems in the beginning, persistence, courage, and belief can carry you through. When I first decided to learn English, I was far from confident. The language looked complicated, the sounds were unfamiliar, and every attempt I made seemed to highlight how far behind I was. Many times, I felt embarrassed because people didn't understand me, or they laughed at my broken sentences. But even in those moments, something inside told me not to stop. I believed that if I kept going, step by step, no matter how slow, one day I would reach fluency. That belief became the engine that pushed me forward when everything else seemed to stand against me. I started in the simplest ways. I had no teachers guiding me, no advanced materials, and no modern tools. What I had was curiosity and determination. I picked up old magazines, newspapers, and even street signs to collect words. I repeated them again and again, even when they sounded strange coming from my mouth. I listened to English programs on the radio, though. I barely understood anything at first. My ears struggled, but I forced myself to continue, and gradually, the strange sounds started to form meaning. The more I surrounded myself with the language, the more it began to feel less like a foreign enemy and more like a friend I was getting to know. Of course, the journey was never easy. There were countless failures along the way. I mispronounced words so badly that people laughed. I mixed up tenses and confused words that sounded similar. Many times I froze in the middle of a conversation, unable to finish a sentence. Each of these moments tested my patience, but instead of letting them crush me, I chose to treat them as lessons. I realized that being corrected was not an insult, it was an opportunity to grow. Every failure was not a signal to quit, but a stepping stone to move forward. One thing I discovered was that learning English was not only about memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules. Real progress came when I used the language in real situations. I began practicing whenever I had the chance. I talked to friends who knew a little English. I approached tourists who visited my city. And when no one was around, I spoke to myself in the mirror. At first, my sentences were broken, but communication happened, and that was what mattered. The more I spoke, the more natural it became, and every conversation gave me a little more confidence to try again. There were times when I felt no progress at all. Days passed when I thought I was stuck in the same place, and frustration whispered that maybe I wasn't capable of learning. But persistence is stronger than frustration. I told myself that learning a language is like climbing a mountain. The path is steep, and sometimes you can't see the peak, but if you keep walking, step after step, you will reach higher ground. That mindset kept me moving forward, even on the days when motivation was weak. A habit that helped me transform my learning was making English a part of my daily routine. I thought in English whenever possible, creating sentences in my head. I wrote notes and diaries in English, even if they were full of mistakes. I watched movies and tried to copy the lines, repeating them until they sounded closer to what I heard. Slowly, English stopped being a subject I studied only in certain hours of the day. It became a natural part of my life, woven into everything I did. Another breakthrough came when I stopped aiming for perfection. In the beginning, I was obsessed with grammar, afraid that every mistake would make me look foolish. But I realized that people cared more about understanding my ideas than my accuracy. Once I focused on communication rather than perfection, my fear began to fade. I spoke more freely, and the more I practiced, the fewer mistakes I made naturally. Confidence became my greatest tool, and it grew stronger with every step I took. Looking back, I see that my journey from beginner to fluent was more than just about learning English. It was about building a mindset that values persistence over speed, resilience over fear, and courage over embarrassment. It was about discovering that small daily efforts add up to something powerful over time. It was about realizing that no matter where you begin, with patience and determination, you can reach a place that once seemed impossible.